Hey, Nizar and Uriel, you guys can come back on screen. Hi, everybody. We're gonna get started with the formal program now. My name is Lauren. I'm the Hillel director here at IC, and I'm really grateful to see you all tonight. I've had dreams, a lot of dreams, about making the perfect introduction to this program. And somehow every morning when I wake up and I sit down to write the introduction, all those words escape me. And that's because it's very impossible to articulate all of the feelings, all of the truths, all of the narratives in just a few words or even an hour and a half. And so I want to say right now to all of you that tonight does not seek to do that. We are not trying to get everything right, but we are trying to come to some greater understanding after hearing from two people about their own truths. Tonight, I'm joined by two people that have become my friends. Uriel and Nizar and I have worked together on this same program for years. We have done this 5 times, but this time is different. And when we got together, we realized that we couldn't do the same program that we had done in past years. This has always been a group project of the 3 of us. We have created this together. We're talking about the conflict, but I know that just saying the words, the conflict, are going to signal to some of you in here tonight that I have a fundamental misunderstanding of the gravity of this situation. And I just want to ask for your patience because the imperfection of language is going to necessitate some forbearance for us all. There are going to be moments of discomfort, and there are going to be times that you disagree with what you hear or times that you've never heard what you've heard before. And I guarantee that is going to happen for all of us multiple times, including myself. Because tonight isn't a dialogue, tonight is an encounter. We have not practiced this. It's our job here in the room to be witnesses and to maintain good faith that these people who are coming to share their stories and be vulnerable with us are doing so because we believe that now more than ever, it's important that we enter into these spaces and hear things that we've maybe never heard before and maybe disagree with, but hear it from someone's mouth so that we can be in real relationship with it and with them. I want to celebrate you all for coming through the door tonight because it's not easy to do this. It takes a lot of faith. And I also want to say that I think that making the choice to step through into these difficult spaces can set a compass, not just for our campus community, but really have the resounding effects of like a pebble in a pond to grow out into the greater world. And it is not happening a lot. It didn't happen a lot 5 years ago when this room was very empty. And it's happening even less now as we find that these compassionate gatherings for real, honest conversation are becoming fewer and harder to do. We think that this is a key foundation to actually building a lasting peace, and this is one small step that we can take. From our seat here in the United States, I would even go so far that to get out of our bubbles on social media, that joining together when we have these opportunities is an obligation. There are a lot of voices out in the world right now who are intent on stoking fires of a widening divide and fomenting hatred. It's upon each of us to dismantle those, and by coming and being present, to resist hate or bigotry, no matter what the flavor. I mentioned truth earlier. This idea of truth in this post-truth world that we live in is very hard to figure out. I hear from students all the time that they don't know what trustworthy sources are. They don't know who to believe. And a lot of our information is being funneled to us through algorithms. I want to say tonight, we are hearing from two individuals that are just speaking their own truths. There are truths, there are facts, there are data, but we also know that who writes the truths and where you're digesting it from or who the author can leave a lot of room for omission, for what is said and what is not said, and whose voices are elevated and whose voices are not. So tonight we are really truly hoping to keep all of these two voices on a platform, but to say clearly, these are just the two truths of Uriel and Nizar. These are not monolithic societies, and they're just two individuals. And in fact, they're here tonight to share about how truth changed over the course of their lives, how their understanding of the conflict shifted over time, and how they came into conflict at times with the people closest to them as they wrestled with this idea of truth or the reality in such a complex situation. So in times of crisis, and we are certainly in a crisis right now, we often tend to retreat to our most deeply held beliefs. And I want to say that I appreciate that. And as somebody who works in identity, I understand that that is important. It is important for us and for you to have safe places to go back to. But to come out of those safe places at times is just as important, so that when you return to them, you bring back a greater understanding of the wider world. Now it's time for me to tell you a little bit about our esteemed speakers tonight. Uriel Abulof is an associate professor of politics at Tel Aviv University. Uriel, will you wave? That's him. And if you were here during the intro, and we'll play it during the outro, all those collections of photographs were a mixed collection of our two speakers' family photos from as far back as they could find. So you may have seen some bar mitzvah pictures of Uriel as well. Uriel is currently teaching at Cornell University. He studies the politics of fear, happiness, hope, legitimation, social movements, nationalism, and ethnic conflicts. Uriel is the recipient of the Young Scholar Award in Israel Studies, and he's published over 60 peer-reviewed academic articles and several books and edited volumes, including The Mortality and Morality of Nations and Living on the Edge, The Existential Uncertainty of Zionism. He is currently working on several book projects, including Nemesis, How Existential Conflicts Make Us Our Own Worst Enemies, which is on the subject of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Nizar in Washington, D.C., and Uriel's coming to us all the way from Israel, which is why we're doing this so early. It's very late where he is. Nizar is coming to us from Washington, D.C. Nizar is a trainer on leadership, negotiations, and advocacy with over 20 years of experience across the Middle East and North Africa. Nizar was the head of civil society partnerships at the Project on Middle East Democracy, where he built the advocacy capacity of Arab civil society organizations. Before that, he directed the Palestinian delegation in Washington, D.C. between 2003 and 2008. Nizar advised senior Palestinian leaders, including the president and the prime minister, and various ministries in their negotiations with Israel. Nizar co-founded an online leadership training platform, which is called Inspired Leadership School, and he is also on the board of the Museum of the Palestinian People, which is located in Washington, D.C. So here's how this is going to go. When we began planning, and we got together this year, the three of us realized that because this year is different, we couldn't do the same program that we had done in the past. We started asking the why of why we're gathering, And we decided that the program this year should have a framework of storytelling of 4 times that your mind changed in relation to the conflict and how that played out for you personally, in your family, in your community, and in your life. It took a really long time to get there, so then we broke for 2 weeks and we thought about those 4 times. And when we came back, Nizar and Uriel had, lo and behold, chosen the same 4 moments in history without communicating with each other, which made this program very easy because tonight they're just going to go one by one and talk about these 4 points in their lives. One last thing I want to reiterate. We're not having a debate tonight. We're having not even really a dialogue. We're having an exposition or an exploration of change under some of the most extreme circumstances that I could imagine. And so after we share these 4 points, or they share these 4 points, they're going to have about 5 minutes each to talk about the points that surprised them, that they heard in the other one's narratives. And then we're going to open up the space for question and answer. Because of the situation with the computers and stuff, I'm going to ask you write your questions on the cards, and we'll go around and collect them, and we'll ask as many as possible. Does that sound good to everyone? They're going to be able to see you because I'm going to move the computer around right now. And they will be able to hear you too, but there's no need for you to speak yet. So with that, I'm going to get started. And I think, Nizar, you are our first speaker. Give us 1 second to just turn this around so you can see our audience tonight.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming. And just to add to what you said, Lauren, the 3 of us also, when we thought of this, we thought what would be useful, and we agreed that given our experiences, Uriel and myself, what would be useful for this audience is experiencing and witnessing what is it like to for your thought and your values to evolve, because your generation happens to be at a disadvantage because of the social media's echo chambers. So it's much more difficult for your generation to get out of or be exposed to challenging narratives and challenging pieces of information in ways that my generation and Uriel's did not have that much. Anyway, so without further ado, the event, so the first events were in the 1980s, experiencing, I was born and raised in Dubai, so I was in Dubai. My father was a Palestinian from the West Bank, but he was exiled because of the 67 war. And I grew up on my father's, I'm also timing myself so that I don't go over. Let me just put this in front of me. So I grew up with my father's stories of Palestine and how beautiful it is, and the valleys and the vineyards and the olive trees, and his longing to go back. Like, he believed that he was going back despite all the difficulties, especially in the 80s. And I remember very well how his friends, when they would come over for dinner or lunch, would say how crazy he is to think that somebody like him would be able to go back when he was part of the Palestinian resistance and he was blacklisted in 3 countries. And yet he believed. And indeed, in the 90s, he was able to come back thanks to the Oslo process. And before that, we experienced the first Intifada. And I remember very well when we were in Dubai, it was both a shock, nobody expected it to come, but also the pride in the capacity of our cousins and relatives there to actually stand up despite all the difficulties. That gave us hope. That made us feel that despite all the defeats that we've had with Israel in the previous wars, we're still standing, to quote Elton John. But with that, I remember also that for those who don't know, in 1988, the Palestinians declared their state. They were in the Palestinian parliament in exile in Algiers. They declared a Palestinian state based on the two-state solution on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And we were all very happy and we were joyous that finally we're going to have our state and we will be able to determine our own fate. And one of my favorite teachers, Miss Idilby, I remember she was my favorite teacher. She was our chemistry teacher, and she was one of my favorite teachers. She actually happened to be from Haifa. And when all of us were like celebrating and what have you, I still remember her face actually. She looked at us with a forced smile, saying, "Yeah, I'm happy for you, but I didn't get anything from this cake." Because of course the two-state solution did not give people like her the right to return to her hometown. And it dawned to me for the first time that what would be something celebratory for me might be something that something to mourn for somebody else who I also care about, who's also Palestinian, right? That was, I guess, my, let's say, my voyage of initiation or the loss of innocence of realizing there is no such thing as a real happy ending. It is not, none of this is pure, none of this is complete. It's all messy, and there is always a cost to any good thing that you're gonna create. And kind of that is where I'm coming from when it came to experiencing that despite all the stories we had, whether from our families or at school, that ultimately good wins. Yes, and it comes at a cost. It doesn't come for free. It doesn't come clean. Other people lose, and that's just a fact of life. So that has been my experience of the 1980s.
Thank you so much, Nizar, and thank you, Lauren, and for everyone attending. And good evening. I should say probably good night from Jerusalem, where I was born and bred, spent almost my entire life in this city. And I guess that being born in Jerusalem and spending so much of my life here gives me some sense, perhaps, of what many Palestinians refer to when they speak about sumud. Perhaps you've heard that term, steadfastness onto the land. I don't know if it's so much the land in my case, but it is the hometown. And there is a very much sense of home when I'm returning to Jerusalem, whenever I leave, even for a short while. And I thought maybe I should start with one of those returns to Jerusalem, which was relatively recent. I spent 3 years in a sort of an extended sabbatical at Cornell. And I returned to Jerusalem. It was just, I think, about a week or so before the 2022 election that gave rise to Bibi, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, all of that. And I told my wife, I have to understand where this is coming from, especially Ben-Gvir, a very extremist right-wing politician in Israel, who was basically a terrorist. And nobody really took seriously until fairly recently, the past 4 or 5 years. And so I actually went to meet the guy. And my wife was very much scared of what might happen to me. It was fine. It was me and about, I don't know, 60, 70 ultra-Orthodox Jews meeting in Jerusalem. And I was sitting very close to him, the way that, I don't know, this screen is in front of me. And he was quite willing to answer all my questions. My sense of him was that he actually lives in 1929, in the massacre of the Jews in Hebron. And that he has this almost yearning desire to reanimate that in order that for this time, the Jews will emerge victorious, that they will not be slaughtered the way that they have been in 1929. And I also remember when he said that his moment of awakening to the conflict was the first Intifada. And I thought to myself, well, just like me, we're about the same age, born and lived much of our lives in Jerusalem. also raised by traditionalist religious Mizrahi family. His and mine coming from Iraq. My mother was born in Iraq. So what's the difference? I remember later I was writing a piece. Did I meet the Jewish Hitler? I mean, that sense of humiliation, and now time for revenge. And so when Loren was asking about time, that was pivotal, the first Intifada, but I should qualify it now. Because I later remembered that it wasn't really the first Intifada when it started. That is 1987. It was actually a couple of years before that my political awakening started. Before that, before 1984, 3, 4, I was very much a right-winger. Still a boy, of course, right? What did I know? But everyone around me, family, friends, schools, whatever, they belonged to the right wing. And so was I. And I remember the election campaign of the Likud before 1984, dismissing the Labour Party, the left Labour Party, saying that they will retreat from Lebanon. Who can ever imagine doing anything like that? And yet, that's exactly what happened in 1984, once the Labour became part of the government. And I started questioning myself. Could it be that the sort of stuff that my classmates, that my family were telling me is not entirely the case? And at one point, that was very close to the first Intifada, maybe throughout the first Intifada, I don't remember. But we had this sort of a class, there was some sort of organization that was invited to our school, and they just provided us with data about the conflict. I especially remember they had a sort of a blue book, a small one, but giving numbers about the conflict. How many Jews, how many Palestinians, bits and pieces about the conflict. And I was completely bewildered by that. I remember holding that blue book and reading it again and again, trying to make sense of it. I was very young at the time, but I was completely immersed. I remember I was sending mail, obviously not an email, sending mail to the prime minister at the time, Shimon Peres. So it was just before the first Intifada. And he actually replied. We had a brief correspondence going on. I was just a boy. I can't even imagine something like that happening today with Bibi. But that was my foundational experience during the 1980s.
You have a question?
No, just saying, good.
Great, thank you, Uriel. I have a question, but I'll ask it in the end. So, come the 90s, I had so because we lived in Dubai, we didn't experience like the pain of the Iraq-Iran war, but it was always on the news, right? And when there was a ceasefire or like the truce, as far as we were concerned, Iraq was victorious and the Arabs were victorious against those Persians, right? For us, it was a threat. It wasn't Shia Sunni. It was mostly Persians against Arabs, and that Saddam was protecting the Eastern Front, but also, we were proud of Iraq because it was the one oil country that actually used its oil wealth for education, for development in its country, for technology. So I remember very well, actually, one of the speeches for Saddam, in which he says they have built so much chemical weapons, they can burn half of Israel, right? Now, of course, he was exaggerating, but to be so audacious and so bold for us, again, especially after the defeats of 67 and 73 and then 1982, it was this strong Arab who's standing up and using the oil wealth for becoming a stronger country, unlike the Gulf countries. In general, we as Palestinians look down at the Gulf countries as just wasteful and using the money just to be rich and not really building development, and that they were monarchies, what have you. So when Saddam occupied Kuwait, ironically, a lot of us actually celebrated it, that a nationalist government Ba'athist nationalist Arab country, defeated an oil monarchy, and especially that there were grievances that the Palestinians had with the Kuwaiti monarchy and what have you. Now, when I look back, I see, and I'm ashamed, in fact, of the fact that how could I take this stance when it's an occupation, right? How did I not empathize with the Kuwaiti resistance and so on and so forth? But back then it was more about this sense of strength, this sense of after years of feeling weak and humiliated by Israel and the West and what have you, here is this Arab country that's standing up and able to, do what it wants and stick it to the Americans, right? And at the same time, I also that's when I went to Lebanon to study at the American University of Beirut, and what I had learned in Dubai about Lebanon was, how the Palestinians were massacred in Sabra and Shatila and Tel Zatar, how there was discrimination against the Palestinians. So when I went to Lebanon, in fact, and lived there, as I was studying, I actually did encounter other stories of Lebanese that were wronged by the Palestinians and how badly Palestinians treated a lot of the Lebanese in the south and so on and so forth, which was shocking for me because I always thought of ourselves as the victims, right? I couldn't imagine them doing something like that, but I couldn't deny the stories that, like, they're actual stories. It's not like challenging numbers. Like my friend Bernard, his family went through XYZ. Like, I cannot deny his story. And at the same time, talking to some of my friends, Palestinian refugees, who also could not think of themselves as oppressors or doing wrong. We are refugees, we are victims, we've been victimized, we cannot do wrong. And it struck me how dangerous it is to think of yourself as a victim and not realize that there isn't good or evil, there are good deeds and evil deeds, and just dismissing that you could do anything wrong. And not so ironically, it actually helped me understand why Holocaust survivors would be able to do atrocities, right? It's the second that you think that you are a victim and get wrapped into that story and not understanding the complexity of all human experiences. And that was my entry point to that. The final point, I'll say very quickly, was the Oslo process. We were very concerned that it was agreed behind closed doors. It wasn't the actual negotiating team that was in Washington. We had our misgivings about the PLO because we knew it was corrupt and compromised so much because it was in a very weak position. It negotiated from a position of weakness and therefore gave in a lot to the Israelis. So we were very disappointed with the Oslo Accords because it put us in a very weak position, but we also were happy that we finally had, some space in Ramallah and Bethlehem and other places where we just did not have to deal with any Israelis, and that we were able, as diaspora Palestinians, to go there. So that was my experience of the 90s.
So the 90s, maybe I should start before the 90s to say that, my insight from everything on during the 1980s, that blue book was, and the first Intifada, is that there is no tremendous difference between what Jews have been trying to do, the Zionist endeavor of national self-determination, and what the Palestinians are trying to do. So if we are a people, the Jewish people, if we want self-determination and we manage to get it, the state of Israel, why shouldn't the Palestinian? I mean, that was the sort of moral insight as a young boy that I've had at the time. Now, the question, of course, was, is it really possible? I mean, can something like that happen? And it made sense that it's not possible, that any substantial move towards compromise peace is impossible. It made sense, and yet 1989. And it's very hard for me to convey to you, people who are so much younger than I am, this sort of thrill that I experienced as a boy watching that. Everything that you were taught to believe in, the Cold War, this sort of superstructure that is like frozen in time, and in no time it disappears like a house of cards. And the fall of the wall and the Soviet bloc, all of that. And it gave hope. And I think that hope is something that I carry with me in both the personal and the more intellectual, public sense. And it's something that I'm wrestling with. And so, for example, Nizar, 1992, the Gulf War, for me, I mean, it was partly fun because we get all these exemptions during high school, but also not a sense of strength, almost embracing the sense of vulnerability, of weakness. Because Israel was bombed, it did nothing. It was just being bombed relentlessly. Now, very few people actually got hurt, so that was part of the equation. But basically, it was the world, the Western world, especially the US, coming to fight that war in a way for us, of course, mainly for Kuwait, but also for Israel. And that was an interesting sensation. I think that helped eventually bring about the Rabin government that made the Oslo peace accord. And that was a tremendously hopeful times during that era of the 1990s. But then things started to change. For me personally, I was enlisted to the IDF after my first degree. And it wasn't just peace negotiations. It was terrorism. It was the massacre in Hebron, the cave of the patriarch, and on the Palestinian side, the terror attacks against civilians, cafe shops bombed, supermarkets, buses everywhere, unsafe to walk in the street. And then to make things worse, as part of the Jewish reaction to that, we had the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin by a Jewish zealots. And the most devastating moment for me was sitting at my family's Seder dinner, right, during Passover, and hearing from my own family, people ultimately endorsing the assassination. Well, of course, because we were threatened. And I got to the point where it was just too much for me during that Seder dinner. And I said in Hebrew, enough is enough, I just left. And I sort of cut ties with my, the larger tribe, the family, the larger family. And it was tremendously hard. And it wasn't just the family. In a sense, it was even the broader family. At that time, I said to myself and others, if this is what Judaism means, I'm no longer Jewish. I'm no longer Jewish. I called myself, I'm a Hebrew. This is what I am now. But the terror continued after the assassination of Rabin. Peres was the prime minister then. And it was horrible in Jerusalem. You couldn't get on a bus. And I remember myself at that time thinking, you know what, if that's how it goes, if this is what the Palestinians want, I was thinking to myself, if this is what they want, okay, let them have Bibi. I didn't support Bibi, but I was so much in pain for what I was seeing before me. And of course, Bibi won. Bibi won. Arafat tried to fight Hamas for a brief period of time, but it was, I don't know if too little, but it was certainly too late. Bibi won, and everything changed after that.
Thank you, Uriel. So yeah, so there's a lot of that. It's just the immensity of how things could change. Definitely, the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, but also that an Arab country occupies another Arab country. It was so shocking, and the assassination of Rabin, right? Like you would expect a Palestinian or an Arab to try to assassinate an Israeli prime minister. That an Israeli kills an Israeli prime minister, that was such a shock for us. So kind of that's the source of how I realized that never say never, right? Like anything is actually possible. realizing that all of these constants are actually never constants. The only constant is change. And therefore, there's always hope. Is how do you influence it as opposed to just sit and watch it? For me, when I experiencing, living in Palestine and like the 2000s, is specifically like something people do not understand about the Oslo process and then the Camp David Accords or the Camp David talks, is that as far as we as Palestinians were concerned, all we saw was a continuation of the occupation. Still lands were being confiscated by the Israeli army, still settlements were being built, Palestinians were being killed, right? I remember there was I was going to work one morning, and there was a lot of Israeli jeeps in front of a house in the village next to us, and I wondered what it was. Anyway, to make a long story short, when I came back home, I learned what the story was, and it was this old man that was mistakenly shot by the Israeli forces. They were trying to get his nephew, and they shot him by mistake. But then they let him bleed to death and denied the ambulance to help him. And that was before the second Intifada. So there were a lot of those incidents that people, like, it wasn't making the news in the West. And therefore, people were not seeing that. For as far as we were concerned, we were hemorrhaging, we were in pain. And the Oslo process was like the Israelis are taking advantage of it to deepen their occupation. Before the Oslo process, with the first Intifada, there's a lot that the Israelis didn't do because of the Intifada. So when the Intifada erupted in September of 2000, we were not shocked, one, but also it gave us a sense of power, because we saw how those same Israeli soldiers that were humiliating us in checkpoints in the 90s, those same soldiers were suddenly scared of us, the unarmed civilians. So this flipping of who's powerful, who's scared of whom, who's hiding, and who's taking initiative, right? Finally, we're taking initiative as opposed to the Israelis taking initiative. So there was a lot there of a sense of agency. And one of my friends, they were a couple. She was British, he was Swedish, but his father was Israeli. She worked with us in the NGO in Bethlehem, and he was working in Jerusalem. So while we were, she and I, Beatrice and I, were in the office working, the checkpoint, the Bethlehem checkpoint, was just a block away, and we were hearing the shooting, and all of us in the office were chanting, "Yeah, yeah, yeah!" And she was going, "What are you happy about? This is shooting, right?" She couldn't understand why we were happy that shooting was happening. And as far as we're concerned, yes, of course, it was like, pathetic Palestinian machine guns against, bigger Israeli machine guns. But as far as we were concerned, we were finally taking initiative and trying to influence this process and moving it a bit closer to where we wanted to be, as opposed to where Israel was dragging us. And at the same time, like a few days later, I learned there was a bus bombing in Jerusalem. And my friend Alon, who was B's boyfriend, who was Swedish Israeli, this was a bus that he usually takes. And he wasn't there. It wasn't that bus that he took, but it was the same number, the same route. And it was the first time that I realized, oh my God, like, actually, I could lose somebody I know or I care about in those bus bombings. Again, the same lack of cleanliness of a fight, that it's not like there's a clear winner and a clear loser. Even if we win with the suicide bombings, because we're terrorizing the Israelis just as much as they're terrorizing us, and therefore there will be a equilibrium of terror, Alon could be dead, right? So that it's never that simple and clear the way our teachers and demagogues or politicians make it seem. I'll stop here.
Yeah, exactly. So apropos the attempts of politicians to make everything so neat, so clear. It reminds me, I was speaking about 1989 and that hope, but of course, in Israel, 1999 was also hopeful for the left-wing camp because of the rise of Barak. He defeated Bibi. So finally, again, we got a chance for peace. This is how we saw it. And then, of course, you have the Camp David negotiations and the failure of those negotiations. And Barak returns, and everything is very clear. Everything is very clear. It's the Palestinians' fault, and especially Arafat's fault. Okay? No Palestinian partner for peace. And this is the leader of the peace camp in Israel saying. Once that realization dawned on the Israeli public, it was so markedly different from what happened after or during the first Intifada. Because if during the first Intifada, some people like myself thought, okay, this is like the Jewish people. They want a state of their own, side by side Israel. The conclusions of many Israeli Jews in the second Intifada, to a certain extent, including myself at the time, was, oh, no, 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 no. This is not what they want. They don't want a Palestinian state side by side Israel. What they really want is a Palestinian state to replace the state of Israel. Because there is no legitimacy for a Jewish state in whatever sort of borders in the historic Palestine, the land of Israel, whatever we might call it. And everything was just a vast manipulation. Because if Barak is offering, and after the Camp David negotiations, there was Taba close to 100%. If you're saying no to that, well, obviously, what you want is to replace us. That was a moment of dash hope and the tremendous escalation of violence, including numerous suicide attacks in Israel, mostly perpetrated by Hamas, but not just Hamas. It was a tremendous blow to the peace camp. We have never recuperated ever since. All the other attempts were somehow struggling to find some sort of another way to go at it. So, of course, another way to go out at it was the disengagement, right? The retreat, the complete retreat of all forces and settlers from the Gaza Strip and some outposts in the West Bank. And some people mentioned, okay, so maybe now the Gaza Strip will become, well, they said, the Singapore of the Middle East or the Hong Kong of the Middle East. There were much hopes about that. But that, of course, was dashed as well. First with Hamas winning the election and then basically forcefully taking over the Gaza Strip. And everything is going to hell. Because Hamas was very clearly much more interested in building the infrastructure needed in order to attack Israel rather than to actually build Palestinian sort of state in the making. And to make it even worse, as a result of the Hamas rising, and even more so, the result of the Second Lebanon War, Bibi got back to power. Why even more so the Second Lebanon War? Because in the case of Lebanon, the retreat of Israel, before that, Barak retreated from Lebanon entirely. Okay, so no IDF soldiers in Lebanon. So why on earth keep on attacking Israel? And when that happened, the Second Lebanon War, and especially with Hezbollah's and Nasrallah's speech about Israel being a sort of a cobweb society, so fragile that you can just swish it away. And the sense was, they are just looking for any sense of weakness, any sense of retreat in order to obliterate us. It's not about this territory or that territory. It's the obliteration of Israel. And I think, look, it becomes a sort of a personal obsession for me to understand the rise of Bibi and his continuous power. And I think that in many ways, it is when we see the worst in people, we Israelis, when we see the worst in people, and especially with our neighbors, Arabs, Palestinians, is that we turn to the person who regularly sees the worst in people. And this is Netanyahu. This is his appeal, because he taps into the worst sensation that you can have about human nature, humanity as it is. He symbolizes that, he manifests that. Man to man a wolf, that's Bibi, incarnation. And so when you have a sense that this is the way the world is, that people will be eating each other alive, you turn to that one person that always sees the world that way. And of course, promises that he will deliver, that he will guard. It's a failed promise, as we have later learned. But that was the promise, I think.
Yeah, so actually you did remind me about Camp David. I remember very well that we were actually scared that Arafat was going to sell us out. It's hard to explain, but for us as Palestinians, you have this tension between, because we're stateless, because we're a liberation movement, we're vulnerable. Arab regimes take advantage of us. It's hard to get unity. So because we want unity, we compromise on democracy and a better way of running things. So we always look to the chief. We never actually challenged Arafat, right? We would disagree with him, and yet we wouldn't challenge him because we're so petrified of disunity. So when he was going to Camp David, because we knew that he had so much historical and cultural political legitimacy, he was able to like compromise on things that we didn't want him to compromise on and then sell it to us. So when he refused what you call the offer, for us, it was not an offer, it was an insult, because there was no control over the airspace, it was cantons, what have you. There was a lot of it. So I was saying, if he accepts that, I am going to shoot him, right? That was my mentality. So when he didn't, I was actually very proud of him that he didn't, right? And you have to give it to Arafat that he actually was very attuned to where his people were. But that was about it. There was no actual strategic thinking of where we're going or how we're going. He was very tactical, not strategic. Moving forward, it was always a struggle of how can we get what we want? How can we be effective in the negotiations if we are so weak? So, okay, we need to be stronger. How can we be stronger when we don't have control on the land? So this tension between resorting to violence when you know you are weaker and not resorting to violence when you know nothing happens. Because as far as we were concerned, the first intifada was non-violent and we still didn't get our rights, right? So that there is a limit to what non-violence could do. And seeing that Hezbollah actually did manage to get Israel to withdraw without an agreement, I remember my friends in Bethlehem saying, we weren't as happy seeing the PA come to Bethlehem as we were seeing Hezbollah managing to kick Israel out of Lebanon. There was more dignity in that one than in the PA or the PLO coming to Palestine, having compromised so much, right? And then, of course, Gaza and what have you. And coming to October 7th, because we're supposed to talk about October 7th, the whole period from, let's say, the last 15 years, of course, the failure of the peace process, there was like, because I actually worked in negotiations, it was very frustrating to realize that there was no Israeli interlocutor that could see a solution or like offer a solution that was even close to the minimum that we would accept. So that was very frustrating. But at the same time, we could also see the manipulation of Bibi, right? Like the fact that he was, eating the peace camp, and Hamas on the other side had its own agenda that was also eating at the process, right? So come October 7th, again, it was this element of huge surprise. I personally did not think that Hamas had this much intelligence on Israel. I always thought that Hezbollah was much more competent than Hamas. So the way people looked at as Hezbollah as the competent Arab, the Arab that actually manages to have deterrence with Israel, we thought Hamas was a Hezbollah wannabe. In October 7th, they showed such level of sophistication, such level of intelligence. It actually showed Palestinians that yes, we can. Yes, we can. We can make Israelis realize that they can attempt to talk to the the Gulf countries. They can attempt to bypass us as much as they want. But when push comes to shove, they will never have security until they talk to us and give us the minimum, our minimum rights. So it was destroying that myth that you don't need to talk to the Palestinians and you can just dismiss them. So it puts us right smack in the middle of, in fact, the world, not only Palestine, Israel. It put us back in the map. And with that, the last thing that came with it also is we forget as Palestinians who have constantly been under occupation or as refugees, like the things that we've experienced, we forget that the rest of the world did not live that. So the surprise that the world had at the brutality of October 7th, that shocked us, or at least let me talk about myself. That actually offended me, that that seeing people on the street that were killed, and I was like, what do you think happened in 1948? What was Tantura and Deir Yassin? So it was so offensive to see, the Americans and the Europeans really getting outraged over the massacre of Israelis, but then completely, absolutely zero empathy to what had happened to the Palestinians just before that, right? That sense of not mattering, that sense that Jewish lives are much more important than Arab lives. And here in the US, where one professor in Columbia, because he was scared of words Palestinian students chanted, you get 3 Ivy League schools being, summoned to Congress, and you have this inquisition on anti-Semitism. But then, a 6-year-old kid gets stabbed 26 times who was Palestinian. 3 students get shot in Vermont, and we're still prioritizing how Jews feel in the US as opposed to actual physical injury and death of Arabs and pro-Palestinians in the US. That level of some lives matter more than others, just experiencing it to that extent was, and still is for me, very, very difficult to accept, and is at the essence of the bitterness and soreness that I have, that I'm still wrestling with.
Yeah, we've come to the hardest part, I guess. I guess that one aspect of soul searching that I should engage with more than I have so far is my very belated awakening to activism. I've seen myself as a scholar. This is what I do. I teach, I study, I publish, whatever. But it's only really since the election of the current government that I became, like many other Israelis, I'm not exceptional in that regard, a sort of an activist trying to fight against the current government because of its attempt to undermine Israel's democracy. But we have rarely done anything even remotely close to that to fight against the occupation. And of course, the main reason, I imagine, is that we saw it differently. When we looked at the occupation, which we recognize as it is, there is an occupation, especially, of course, in the West Bank now, since the disengagement. We saw the Palestinians since the Second Intifada as a potential existential danger. It was hard to galvanize that sort of public support to fight for the Palestinians, for Palestine, against the occupation. October 7 was a nightmare. It's a nightmare that I think will haunt me, will haunt all of us for years to come. That morning of waking up to more and more news about what's going on, it was a butchery, plain butchery. It's very hard to convey the sensation of that. I mean, part of that was obviously the failure of Israel. None of us could have imagined that. That was a failed state. Israel on October 7 was a failed state, completely failing us. Women, children crying for help, for someone to come and save them. And they were butchered. They were raped. They were massacred. They were kidnapped. Where was the state? Nowhere to be seen. And I think in some ways, even, I don't know if as hard as that, but a hard element of it was the celebration among the Palestinians. I was looking for moments of some sort of soul searching, apropos soul searching. Some Palestinians, this is wrong, this is bad. With everything horrible about the occupation, we should not be doing that. We live in the French Hill in Jerusalem. 5 minutes from here is the village of Isawiya, the refugee camp of Shoifat. On that Saturday, We look outside the porch. We hear fire. We see fireworks. Celebration time. It went on for days after that, the celebration. And I couldn't help myself thinking, look, I'm 5 minutes from them. If they decide to do something similar, 5 minutes and they're at my doorstep, you know, I will not be the one defending. I have no idea how to use arms, which I don't have. You know, my family, my kids, this is over. On the first night, on that Saturday, I took the kids to my parents, who also lived in Jerusalem, but in a somewhat more remote neighborhood. And the night after that, we returned them home. And not for thinking that now the Palestinians in Shuafat or Isawiya would be afraid to do that, because there was no force to stop them doing it. Only for hoping that they are more afraid of losing the best part of their humanity. And I have nothing better to hold on to than to the best part of our humanity that goes against it, against what happened on October 7th. It was for me facing the possibility of evil, not a metaphysical evil, not an uppercase evil, the lowercase, the human evil, of using people as dispensable things, which is how I came to see the conflict increasing. I call it the chessification of the mind, the chessification of the conflict. Like we are all on a chessboard and you should choose side, right? Either Palestinian or Israeli, good or bad, whatever sort of side you see. And we allow our leaders to use us as pawns, which Bibi has been using the Israelis as, and Hamas has been using the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. I mean, not many people know that, but in public opinion polls during the summer before October 7, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip rejected Hamas. Look at public opinion now, and especially the rise of support in Hamas in the West Bank, where they do not suffer the implications of Hamas rule and the retaliation by Israel. And it's more than that. Loren mentioned living in post-truth. You see public opinion polls in the West Bank asking people, do you think Hamas killed women and children? Not asking if you condone it or opposed to that, not even speaking about the murder of women and children, just factually, did they kill women and children? How many people in the West Bank are saying yes? 1%. 1% recognize that reality. And if you look at the media, social media, not social media, it makes sense. Because if you get your input from Telegram, from TikTok, from Al Jazeera, right, this triangle of Qatar, China, Russia, this is the information that you get. And Israelis are in the same sort of, well, perhaps on the same extent, but also very much ignorant of what is going on now in the Gaza Strip, with over 20,000 people killed, and only a minority of them Hamas armsmen. We shy away from it. We block that. This is the pawnification. We make ourselves into pawns in this game, this atrocious game. And for me, the goal is to do whatever I can, scholarly and otherwise, to end that. I'm still hopeful, but it looks bad, admittedly. I probably should stop with that.
So now we are at the hard part because we're in now. And I know that there's so much pain that we're all holding. And I want to get to question and answers. And I want to remind you that you received an index card, but I also want to give you two guys a few minutes to respond. Was there anything that really surprised you or struck you, what you heard from each other as we go around and collect? And don't be offended if people have class. They have to get to class and or maybe dinner. So we're going to go around and collect the index cards. would you two just speak for a few minutes each to what the other you heard from the other, and that will give us at least 15 or 20 minutes for a question and answer. Yes, Nizar, you can go first.
So what surprised me in what you said was the issue of identity. You said that your family come from a family who was right wing or the right conservative. So I'm trying to understand if it's more out of religiosity or out of being just a conservative community, coming from Iraq and what have you, or is it like cultural, like the difference between, especially in the 70s, right? The rise of the Likud, how much of that was just being sick and tired of a dominant elite that did not represent, oh yeah, I guess representation, like, because you also say that Bibi doesn't represent you, right? So he won the elections 4 times. So tell me more about how you see your identity and representation. Easy questions.
Yeah, the question of identity is huge. We can get even more into that later, but from a personal perspective, yes, he definitely does not represent me, but obviously he represents enough Israelis, right? One of the worst things that we do, I think, is that we keep on saying when something bad happens, it's the politicians. They've done this to us. And if I gave that sort of impression here, that's a wrong impression. I mean, yes, I blame Bibi for many things, but we elected Bibi. Not me personally, but we brought Bibi to power. To a certain extent, I would even say there is more responsibility upon the Israelis in having someone like Bibi and Ben-Gvir, etc., than it is upon the Palestinian in being ruled by Hamas, because Hamas, by and large, has ruled by force. And Israelis have elected again and again those people. Now, Israel is a divided society, you know that. And part of the strife is indeed religiosity. Part of the strife is the Ashkenazi-Mizrahi sort of divide. For me personally, I would like all of you in the hall to be able to see me not as an Israeli, not as a Jewish, not as a professor, as just an individual, a human being. Okay? If you would ask me how I see myself as a wanderer, a person who wander in O and in A, right? Wander from one place to the other, wonder about life, about ourselves. This is me. What I find so hard to deal with is people boxing people in. And I'm trying my best not to do that to others, but it's tempting. It's tempting because it's easy. It's a sort of a shortcut. I guess my sort of question to you would be, soul searching, I guess. I think that this is what myself, many Israelis are almost desperate to see on the Palestinian side. Not soul searching in terms of we're horrible. That's not the issue. Soul searching in terms of saying these are the grave moral mistakes, not pragmatic mistakes. These are the grave moral mistakes that we have made. Because often enough, we have a sense, as perhaps you have alluded to, that when we talk to our Palestinian peers, we see them seeing themselves as righteous victims. And you alluded to that, right? The Holocaust and the Nakba. Is there a possibility for some sort of moral soul searching, saying we did wrong? That was profoundly, morally wrong. About whatever, in the present or the past.
So there is, because I wrestled with that question a lot in different situations, it takes a kind of person either that has not experienced trauma, so Palestinians who lived in diaspora or what have you, or people like, combatants for peace, like experience serious trauma, and because of that trauma are able to empathize, right? So to just generally answer what a Palestinian would generally answer, I would tell you, Palestinians do not have the luxury of morality. Right? Like there is such a power inequality in a world that is immoral, right? Like we over and over again, there's like the Palestinian narrative is this continuous failure of the world to live up to its own claimed values. 1948, Sabra and Shatila happened after the Americans gave guarantees to the PLO that you can leave, but the Palestinians won't get, will be protected. And then the massacre happened. Like all of these incidents in which we believed that X would, the world would never allow X to happen, and then it happens, right? So there's this sense, and this is the main pull of Hamas, is that they turn out to be right. Of course, they know what they did is brutal, but they also know that the world doesn't care, right? They also know that when push comes to shove, what matters is what Israelis think, and all the bad naming of the Palestinians is not going to be as consequential as the Israelis realizing that whether you like them or hate them, Hamas is capable of inflicting serious wounds, just like Hezbollah, and then you have deterrence. Now, the incidents where we have these conversations is when we talk two states, one state, two states, what have you. It's like these are just vehicles, right? I don't care. Like we don't care about peace. We don't care about the state. We care about being free. Whatever achieves freedom, we're gonna take, right? So we accepted the two-state solution because we realized, while ideally one person, one vote would be the ideal situation, we knew that that's just not going to happen because not enough Israelis would buy into that solution. So we accepted the two-state solution as the next best thing. But ultimately, it's about what a situation where we're actually free, and not like almost free, like not sovereignty minded, it's not actually sovereign, right? So when I'm arguing with my friends who support Hamas, I say, okay, fine. Like if you believe that the only solution is, complete decimation or like the complete defeat of the Israelis, and they would be Jewish citizens in an Islamic Palestine state, okay, fine. What are you actually going to do? Like reverse engineer for me how you're going to destroy Israel, but also what kind of Palestine is this going to be? Right? Is this a Palestine I want to be in? Right? So in many ways, I've found myself having more in common with you, with Amira Haas and others, than with many of my actual relatives in Birzeit, right? Where there is a set of values, also with like women's rights or like what the fight between Hamas and Fatah, realizing that yeah, I'm not for any of those things, right? But I also understand, because I used to support suicide bombings and I used to support the violence because of where I was and what I experienced, right? It was this visceral sense of deterrence, that if we give them more pain than they give us, then they'll think twice before they inflict it on us, right? Like it was more a practical calculus, right? Including that realization that with the Intifada, that because it was just in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, there were millions of Israelis that were not impacted. We needed to bring the war to them. The cafe goers in Tel Aviv and Haifa needed to start paying a price because they're just too comfortable where they are. And it's only the Israeli soldiers that are in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that are actually engaging what this occupation is causing, right? Like, so there was a lot of that where there's this why am I losing words? This deterioration, this atrophy of morality. It becomes really difficult to argue morality when you're actually losing ground and practically not moving forward. Yeah, that was extremely inarticulate.
No, that was, I think that everything you said was very important. Admittedly heartbreaking too, to a certain extent. I mean, thinking about the moral soul searching as a luxury, that's I honestly, I'm not sure how to move on from that. I should, because if that is luxury, in my mind, maybe I'm too naive in that sense. Everything falls apart, because if you don't have that, what do you hold onto in some ways? I mean, how can you? But let me leave. I'll leave that aside. I have to think about what it even means, that thinking about moral searching as luxury. But even on a practical terms, wouldn't you say that Palestinians and yourself personally are aware of the fact that that all those acts of terrorism, and certainly what happened on October 7, has not deterred Israel? I mean, it's only perpetuated that cycle of violence, this humiliation and counter-humiliation, and wanting to harm the other, right? To take revenge. This is just an ongoing cycle of humiliation and revenge, humiliation and revenge, humiliation and revenge. I don't see how more acts of violence are going to somehow make the Israelis understand, okay, so enough is enough, we're going to lay our arms. No, it will go to the nightmarish scenarios of some of those crazy people in the Israeli parliament speaking about dropping a nuclear weapon. I mean, it's scary prospects what's going on here. And obviously, I am living in Jerusalem on a detonator. If something happens in the Temple Mount, it's not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, people in the hall, brace yourself. This is World War.
Yeah.
So all of that, and I guess the other question that I had, you mentioned the world doesn't care, but I mean, obviously there is the overwhelming support of the Palestinian cause worldwide since decolonialism, right? Since the late 1960s. It's overwhelming. The UN, right? The ensemble of diplomatic global community has been denouncing Zionism as a form of racism, something that I do not accept. But in terms of world opinion, it's so very clear. I mean, if you go to US campuses these days, but even before that, this is just October 7 and the war is just magnifying it. But even before that, you see it all over the place. So do you
But not in
sense
meaningful ways, right? So it's people without power. It's the UN that gets vetoed by the US every single time.
Russia, China,
Yeah, what difference do they make? Like, they're not as we live in a world where all of these actually don't matter, right? What matters is what the US does, right?
Nizar, you mentioned your friends from who support Hamas were saying, and you asked them, so how exactly is that going to play out, the decimation of Israel? Well, I can tell you how it's going to play out. If you have such tremendous, powerful forces like Russia, like China, like Iran, with the various other elements around it, and the US is turning its back, in some aspect at least, to Israel, there is a real possibility of that, whether the more progressive camp in the Democratic Party or
I have
Trump.
to stop you there. It's fascinating that you think so. Like, for the last 120 days, food, water, electricity has been denied Gaza. What has Russia and China and the whole world done to allow food and electricity
I
in?
completely, absolutely,
so
completely
practically
agree.
speaking, right?
No, I completely
that
agree with that.
support is
Absolutely.
meaningless. Doesn't
Right.
do anything.
No, but I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about, of course, in the context of this particular war, you still see that. But in terms of the larger global forces now at play, and if you look at trajectories, it's a real possibility. It's a real possibility. It's not some sort of hallucination. I mean, if
No,
you
I
look
understand. But we need to
I'm
give
going to pause us. I'm going to pause us because we could go down this rabbit hole, or we could go down the 20 other rabbit holes that I have. And I do think that what I'm hearing you both say, I'm turning on the lights because it's question and answer now. So you can you see everybody?
Yes, we do. I'm just getting water, but I'm hearing.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, there's a lot of questions about power here, and about like who is holding power and where does the power lie. And I hear this all the time with students. This is just like a flip-flop of one group saying this is the power, one group saying this is the power. And I just want to say, sometimes I read things and I don't know actually who the narrator is anymore. I really don't. And I think that there's sometimes that we can say both of these things are really true, and we don't know actually how this is going to go. But I want to go back because a lot of people ask a similar question, and I think it gets a little bit at what you guys are talking about now, which is people asking about a two-state, one-state solution. Like they're asking about, and they're not asking about this, I want to say, in a blow Israel off the map way. They're asking this about reality. Like, what are the possibilities here that you both see? Is it possible to, in this moment, knowing where we are right now, to even consider a two-state solution? What do you see potentially happening? And you can, either one of you can start. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it's still viable. I think the question of a two-state solution is not a question of capacity, but of political will. If there is a will, there is a way to go about it. That's one of Arafat's famous quotes. There is a possibility to go about it. In terms of how practically this will be done, I can, share screen with certain maps that will show that it's a viable way to go about it, that there is a way for the Palestinians to have 100%. There will be some territorial exchange, and I don't see, by the way, no problem in terms of settlers staying in certain places. If they are willing to be residents of a Palestinian, they should be without arms, obviously. If this is what they opt for, yeah, so be it. It's just a question of political will. Now, saying just is obviously diminishing it. It's a huge question of political will, which currently we do not have. Personally, I believe that what Biden is offering to Israel and to the region is a dream package. Israel should have, well, first kiss Biden's hands for helping it so much during the war, and then sign on the dotted line for such a deal. Obviously, that's not the way things are played out. But the two-state solution is still viable. And by the way, if the majority of people are into one-state solution, so be it. That's also okay. I think it's an unviable solution, but that's a possibility as well.
Yeah, so I guess the lesson we learned, at least, is to your point, that actually principles and values matter. We can have two states, both of which are racist, or we can have one state where we're exchanging who's oppressing whom, right? That still doesn't solve the problem. We need to start with equality, right? So I'll give you an example. For those who don't know, Meretz is like the extreme left party in Israel, right? I had a friend at Harvard who was from Meretz, and
not that extreme, but okay.
but just to bring it to anybody, I'm sure that, so for us as Palestinians, part of our frustration with the peace camp is this, attitude of, we're nice people, we believe in human rights, ergo, you need to reciprocate, right? So I would get so frustrated with Danny because, like, I tell him, like, man, I'm very happy that you espouse such amazing human rights values, but I don't owe you anything. If you're doing this because you want me to reciprocate, then you actually don't believe in those values, right? However, he happened to be, their family escaped from Europe pogroms before the Holocaust, from Europe, and went to Argentina, to Venezuela. And then from Venezuela, his family, his nuclear family, went to Israel and did Aliyah. So he was telling me Chavez was in control in Venezuela, and there were some anti-Semitic attacks. And he was telling me, Nizar, listen, I was on the phone with my grandmother in Venezuela telling me that there are men knocking on the door, and she's scared because it reminded her of what happened in Eastern Europe where she was. Right? That I understand, because I have a grandmother, and I would never want my grandmother to feel that kind of existential fear. That's when we actually understand what this is about, right? Again, I'm overselling combatants for peace, but of all the organizations that are out there, they're very incompetent and they have their own issue. But as an idea, right, where, yeah, we know what it costs, and because it costs, we know that this is not going to work until we're on the same page, right? That I do not see why I should have more rights than you. So the way I see it is that the conflict is not really about between Palestinians and Israelis, while accepting that we can't escape the power inequality, but it's really about a camp that believes that human beings happen to be equal. You like them, you don't like them, they're still equal, right? And those who believe that for whatever reason, God being more technology advanced, you somehow have more rights than the other guy, right? And you see that all over the world, like north-south, that we are civilized and you cannot equate us. Those who believe in equality, they're going to start from the right space to create whatever results in equality. What matters is the result, and that's not going to happen until the framework agreement is not resolution 242, not what land for peace, but actual values of equality, security, safety, right, and dignity, right, to live a dignified life. And that, in that sense, everything is possible, right? If you ask people in August 1947 that Israel, you'll have a Jewish state in 80% of what's Palestine, people, oh, you're crazy, right? And if you say, if you said in 2000 that Ariel Sharon is going to lead the removing settlements from Gaza, they would say you're crazy. Everything is possible, right? So in that sense, I believe, yeah, it is possible, but it does. Oh, finally, to the point about the politicians controlling, that's definitely something we learned in the second Intifada, that we need to bring the politics back down to the people. That we've allowed, I totally agree with you. There is and nobody in power is there without the people empowering them, giving them, giving them the power, and that's where we need to bring it back. And this is what Arafat and the Israeli prime ministers never did, which is actually bringing the politics back, so that we as Palestinians discuss between ourselves what is really important about Jerusalem, what is really important about refugees, and likewise Israelis deciding what is more important, the land or the man, the human being, right?
It's crazy that our time is up. I know. And it's 12:30 where you, I mean, it's the middle of the night for you.
I have no problem staying up.
And we love you for that. Because I know that there are students that have to go, I'm gonna make an announcement, but then if it's okay, can we ask like one more question? Because I don't think the conversation's done. Sidra, are you still here? Can I let our student who has to go make an announcement real quick? And then for students.
Okay, this is for students. I grew up in a very
You need to talk loud, Sidra.
Okay. We're having a program really soon. Starting February 20th, it's going to be 3 sessions for students. There's only 15 seats, so please reach out to me. It's going to go over the history of Israel, but from a source I trust a lot. I've taken a course with her before. Her name is Dina Maven. And it's going to start with the Roman Empire and then talk about Oslo and Balfour and the First and Second Intifada and October 7th and all this stuff consolidated into 3 hours, and like Yasser Arafat and Bibi Netanyahu and like all these people. If you have questions when that was being talked about, this is going to give like a crash course. There's only 15 seats, but there's going to be dinner provided, a really cool professor. I like to think it's balanced. I know that's not necessarily possible, but like very open to questions and everything. So if you're interested, please reach out to me or Lauren.
I just want to say, at the end of last semester, of course, with our student leaders, we did analysis. What do we need on campus? What do you think the students need? One of them was this conversation, another was just more deeper learning. So we're trying to build all of those things out, and Sidra took responsibility for deeper learning about the history. So that's that opportunity. Thank you, Sidra. I'm going to, just before too many people leave, I just want to also thank our partner in the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life who signed on to this. And I want to say that Hillel is not a part of Ithaca College, that we are not a formal part of Ithaca College. So when we put on a program like this, I understand sometimes it feels like Ithaca College is doing this thing again, the Jewish voice is doing this thing again. I just want to say, our Hillel is pretty rad, and so we do a lot of things. And we're a nonprofit. We're an independent 501c3. You know, we are supported by the families of students and alums and things like that. I just wanted to clarify that for those who are still here. And I want to ask like a concluding question for you guys, because it could take a nice long time. It's really hard to choose because each one of these questions, there's not like anything that ties this up with a knot.
Flip a coin.
It's not possible.
But Lauren, I just want to say something. Since it seems like we won't be able to cover all the questions,
Yeah.
if some of you would like to approach, at least I would speak about myself, to send an email or whatever, please feel free to. Okay, I'd be happy to try and answer.
So there's a couple themes that I'm like trying to pick out here. One major one is about trust. That people are identifying basically that this cycle of pain, of humiliation, as you both said, violence, has eroded trust. And a few people are asking if you can see a way for these two communities to trust each other, and is there a possible for some kind of formality of that? And I know, like, I just want to speak to the algorithm really quickly, that we are all sucked down, that it is very hard to even find like organizations, and I'm talking about literal Instagram accounts, where you can watch something happen, like, you know, like people in coalition. So if you want to speak a little bit to trust and then offer us some ways to enact this in our life in the United States, because we're situated here on college campus, which is like the epicenter of some other battleground.
I guess it's, I mean, I teach negotiations, and it's very well known that trust is the lubricant, right? Like if you don't have trust, it makes negotiation extremely difficult, right? And that's why most often peace processes start with confidence building measures, right? Now, having said that, what actually matters is not the kumbaya trust. It's knowing the other enough and coming to a point where you trust that you know that they mean what they say and they say what they mean, and they're going to do what they said they're going to do, whether good or bad, right? Once you come to a point where you understand the other party so much that you understand that X is not in their interests, so of course they would want Y, right? So understanding the Holocaust, understanding anti-Semitism, right? That was really helpful for us to understand the security perspective, because objectively speaking, right, a nuclear power that has the strongest army in the region, why would it have security issues, right? But when you come to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and the experience that the Jews have had across generational trauma, right, then you get it, right? And therefore, agree with it or not, you actually trust that that's a variable that is gonna decide whether they say okay or do not say okay on an agreement, right? That requires, in my opinion, not the politicians. The role of the politicians is to, what we say in adaptive leadership, is give the work back to the people. That is, cut the BS. We need the people to decide what they are okay with, because our experience has been when we do second tracks with Palestinians and Israelis, or even with Palestinians and playing different scenarios, once it becomes everybody postures and takes maximalist positions, but once they feel that no, there's a possibility of getting X, if they give up on Y, then people become far more objective, far more flexible. It's just that neither party currently believes that the other party is willing and able to deliver, whether so the majority on both sides believe that the two-state solution is the more practical solution, but both sides also believe that the majority of the other side does not want it, right? So that's where leadership is missing, where if you have people who have that conversation, unlike Arafat and Barak and everybody else under the sun, which I think Marwan Barghouti is one, and the different nonviolence activists in Palestine, then we'll get there. And I'm very hopeful, because what I've been seeing in the youth that I'm engaging is that, for good or bad, they're very unencumbered with the past and very future oriented. That is, it's scary how little they know about Palestinian history, but at the same time, it's amazing how they know their rights, they know this is not working for them, and that they deserve better. And they're not waiting for anyone to get them that, right? So they're not organized, they're not one party, but they are starting from a very selfish place, and that's, I think, the right way to start.
I agree with much of what you said, and not all of it, especially the selfish part, but but much of what you said, and I can go on to some of the more practical, pragmatic aspects of my own take on how we can go about building that sort of collaboration. I mean, my idea for going ahead is to conduct what I call the double referendums among both Israelis and Palestinian on the possibility of a two-state solution in terms of bringing the power back to the people. But, you know, what came to my mind, Loren, when you ask about trust, is a certain quote that is in my mind for the past months or so. So I think I will share the screen because he does it so much better than I could ever, if that's okay. Can I share the screen?
I don't know if you have the capability, but if you don't, I can give it to you.
Can you see it now? So this is by James Baldwin. I wouldn't be able to get into the depth of it. I just would advise you to read it and think about it. I'll read it out loud. Identity would seem to be the garment with which one covers the nakedness of the self. This sentence in it by itself is arresting to me. I think that in one line, he managed to capture the distinction between self and identity. But he goes on, in which case, it is best that the garment would be loose, a little like the robes of the desert, through which one's nakedness can always be felt and sometimes discerned. This trust in one's nakedness is all that gives one the power to change one's robes. And speaking about trust, I would say this trust in one's nakedness, right? Can we, I'll go a bit metaphorical, philosophical, or symbolical on you. Think about, what in Christianity is called the original sin, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Do you remember what is the first thing they do once they realize they are human? Once they taken the bite? What do? Close themselves, right? They hide their nakedness, the fragility of the human condition. That element of choice without control. Like God, we have choice. Very much unlike God, we don't have complete control, right? We haven't eaten from that tree of immortality, the tree of life. And we keep on trying to hide our humanity from each other and from ourselves, that nakedness. And I think this primarily is the thing that we have to rebuild. This is the trust, the most important trust that we should build, this trust in one's nakedness. If we manage to better tap into our humanity, this almost impossible state of choice without control, I think we'll be able to make better choices as we go ahead. To let go of that God complex, that fantasy of omnipotency and omniscience and omnibenevolence, right? All morality, right? All good, all powerful, all grand, all authentic, all of that. We're not any of that. We're not God. But we are, as humans, in that unique capacity to make choices and better choices about our life. If we manage to rebuild that trust, I think we stand better chances also of doing that impossible thing of making peace. even between Israelis and Palestinians. Because in my mind, it's like Frank Sinatra. If we can make it here, we can make it everywhere. And that's something to hold on to. I believe we can.
Nizar, I saw you pop something in the chat. Is that for Uriel?
Yeah, so I just wanted to share on this is an organization called I Am Your Protector, and it's dear friend of mine, Danny Vradi, who's Jewish Israeli Czech. Its main thesis is in order to create those transformation, especially around general, a group of people hating another group for whatever reason, especially on racism. If one person experiences an act of kindness from a group that they perceive as cruel, that's when the transformation happens. That is, a Black person making an act of kindness to a KKK person, right? And it's like, it's been proven psychologically to actually, that's what unravels all of it challenges your worldview in such fundamental way. It actually causes such huge transformation, including terrorists and what have you, right? So I love that resource because I think that's where you can actually start to make a difference, where again, combatants for peace and others are starting from a genuine appreciation that when you're afraid, your first instinct is survival, and it's easier to shoot somebody that's coming from the dark than to take the risk of realizing that they mean you harm, right? Appreciating that that's natural and not judging people for resorting to violence, and knowing, as Uriel said, that no real change happened until some group of people, and usually they're always a minority, transcended this natural instinct of protection and distrust. That takes courage, but also faith in humanity.
It's hard to believe that, like, I've never seen this before either, so I'm deeply moved, and I'm gonna stop us because we can go down so many more paths, and I know I speak on behalf of everybody when I say that the gratitude that I feel towards both of you truly being, you channel from another place, an ability to reach the human core that I'm so grateful for, and it's more important now than ever. I have this whole long ending, but I think I'm just gonna read one sentence, which is that absolutist solutions condemn everyone to endless suffering. And I just want us to end there because I think that what I hope this is just a start. Just a start of a conversation that is grounded in an awareness of the Baldwin quote, and that gets creative, like these two offerings here, for how we can reach across divides. So thank you, Uriel, Nizar.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you. Bye-bye. Shalom. Good night.